Our world is created based on our mindset, based on our beliefs, based on our culture, based on many factors mainly that rely on people's mindset. In this mindset, if we recognize how powerful this is, it is no coincidence that mental slavery is seen as the root form of all forms of slavery. And therefore, if we may be under mental slavery, and we do not recognize that we are, and we see that we live in a world that needs to be improved, and many people would say we live in a world of tyranny, or perhaps slavery by the systems that be, we may need to evaluate our own morals and worldview to simply notice if there are any contradictions by any chance, to see if we may be contributing to that system of slavery, chaos, or confusion. To that system we may even oppose and not realize that we are actually upholding it. Because mental slavery by definition means that you want to be a slave, and how hard could it be to see that you are perhaps being mind controlled? Well, in order to understand this, we may be able to start asking ourselves some questions, and here are some very powerful questions. We'll start with the easy set of questions, and then we'll go to the harder, more direct questions. Here are the 7 moral questions by Brian Young or High Impact Flicks. 1. Do you have the moral right to rule or dominate another individual against their will? 2. Does anyone have the moral right to rule or dominate you if you don't want them to rule or dominate you? 3. Does anyone have a legitimately higher claim over your life and property than you? 4. Do you have a legitimately higher claim over the life and property of another? 5. Do you have a legitimate right to steal your neighbor's stuff? 6. Does anyone have the legitimate right to steal your stuff? And finally, 7. If you don't have the right to steal from or harm another person, can you confer that right that you don't have onto another person or group? If you have to pause the video, do so, but here are the more direct, complicated questions that I deeply encourage you sit with in your conscience to recognize perhaps I don't understand my own slavery, or I don't understand my own worldview, or perhaps I might be wrong, and having that sense of humility to the possibility of ourselves being wrong is how we learn and improve our lives in the very first place, across the board when it comes to any subject matter. But this is rather important. We're talking about a worldview that may deal with other people. So let's get into this. The 5 moral questions by Larken Rose. 1. Is there any means by which any number of individuals can delegate to someone else the moral right to do something which none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? 2. Do those who wield political power, presidents, legislators, etc., have the moral right to do things which other people do not have the moral right to do? And if so, from whom and how did they acquire such a right? 3. Is there any process, constitutions, elections, or legislation by which human beings can transform an immoral act into a moral act without changing the act itself? 4. When lawmakers and law enforcers use coercion and force in the name of law and government, do they bear the same responsibility for their actions that anyone else would who did the same thing on their own? 5. When there is a conflict between an individual's own moral conscience and the commands of a political authority, is the individual morally obligated to do what he personally views as wrong in order to obey the law? Here's a quote from Henry David Thoreau in case you need more clarification on this. He says, "Must the citizen ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then?" He also said, "The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think is right." And finally, he also said, "Is it a freedom to be slaves or a freedom to be free of which we boast?" And this begs the question, are we perhaps under a sense of freedom that isn't actually free? This would constitute mental slavery, and perhaps you might be curious and you may question, well, how can we live in a world without authority or law and government? By these questions and asking ourselves these questions start to make us really curious, like, well, okay, we need to have these systems, so what are we to do? The difference between authority and leadership we covered last time, but here are some really relevant quotes that can clarify this understanding. William Godwin, a philosopher, said, "It is a violation of political justice to confound the authority which depends upon force with the authority which arises from reverence and esteem. The modification of my conduct which might be due in the case of a wild beast with the modification which is due to superior wisdom. The consequence which has flowed from confounding them has been a greater debasement of the human character than could easily have followed upon direct and unqualified slavery." From the Liberty newspaper in the 1800s, the little sergeant was not pleased with his office. He condemned sometimes, often, always, in his inner conscience, the severity which his commanders or the laws obliged him to apply. And yet, a slave of passive obedience, he executed his orders with death in his soul and tears filling his throat, but promptly nevertheless. Adopting a principle for our guide and keeping straight on through calm and storm, we are sure to reach our destination sooner or later. The man of principle is the true leader, the mover and savior of the blind and unhappy masses, while the time server, though called a leader and enjoying for a time popular favor, is actually a slave to the prejudices and passions of the multitude and is led and used by them. Here's another perspective from Jason Gregory, an author, from the excerpt of a video he has titled "The Natural Human Being." We can only leave people alone to live their own lives if we are sincere in our own introspection and willing to discard the conditioning that clouds our unity with our brothers and sisters. Where we are sincerely humble and free from agendas, we nourish and secretly transform the world, again, through not seeking to transform it. A sage has no agenda, and this brings spiritual oxygen into the world. We all have undergone various sorts of conditioning, and we all have the same physical and emotional states, so we can sympathize with the rest of the world which suffers as a result of the same hypnosis as ours. On the other hand, if we are all inherently the same, we also possess the same qualities that a sage lives by. 自然, or naturalness, or self-so in Chinese, can only come to fruition when we trust that everything the universe has produced is fundamentally right and could be no other way. The systems of government, politics, banking, religion, and commerce are unnatural, but they have gotten us to a certain point, and we have learned many lessons from them. It is just that they are no longer needed. If we cannot trust the world and the people in it, we stand no chance for survival, because a species at war with itself is doomed. People often say that they trust the universe, but then they consistently condemn life according to their conditioned perspectives. And so, are we trying to mold the world around us? Are we trying to act as gods? Are we trying to interfere with other people's lives when they own themselves? These are the questions that we have to ask, and I encourage you, if you must, go back in this video and reflect on the 7 and 5 questions, because these questions were the ones that really broke it for me. I always did what I was told, I always was obedient, and I equated that much to virtue because that's how I was raised, even though I was also being taught simultaneously the golden rule and not to harm others because it is wrong. So I was taught two worldviews, and as I asked these questions, I realized there was a contradiction taking place. You might see it as well, and if you do, you might naturally become an abolitionist. Not by force, not because you are watching this video, but merely because you have come to a realization of knowing thyself. Thank you for watching this part of the docu-series Slavery Gone for Good. Be sure to watch our other parts for a more deep understanding as to the nature of truth and action in its fullest extent. If you want to learn more and hear more quotes that have not been discussed in this video, be sure to buy the book Slavery Gone for Good Black Book Edition. This is the most important work in history, and you are part of that work. Do not forget it. As Frederick Douglass, former slave and abolitionist, said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave."